Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It sure has been a while since I've had an interview episode, hasn't it? In fact, I think if I were to look at the exact time that the last interview I had was June 2021. That is over 2 years ago since I talked to Brendan Burton about his work, which still, wonderful conversation. Loved talking to him, and I hope you all go listen to it sometime. It was a very fun time. This time, I am talking to my friend Epiphany Knedler. She is a photographer from South Dakota and still based in South Dakota. It was really awesome having her be the first interview after a kind of unintentional hiatus of talking to other people and doing just kind of solo episodes for a while. But I'm really glad that I was able to have Epiphany on and talk to her about her work, since I originally came across her work by my call for entry for a Sad Bird curated zines that I had done. And she had submitted to both Nothing is Interesting as well as I Can Hear the Road Call. And ever since then, I've been really fascinated by her work, and she and I share a lot of similar perspectives on things, and we go about making our artwork influenced by similar things, but in a very different way, and of course, very different subject matter. So, of course, I would like to give you all a kind of rundown as to who Epiphany is before we all get into the conversation. So, Epiphany Knedler is an interdisciplinary artist and educator exploring the ways that we engage with history. She's inspired by the aesthetics and geopolitical landscapes of the Midwest, surveying stories past of bold exploration and quiet melancholy. She graduated from the University of South Dakota with her BFA in studio art and a BA in political science, and completed her MFA in studio art with an emphasis in photography at East Carolina University. She's based in Aberdeen, South Dakota, serving as a lecturer of art and the co-curator for the art collective Midwest Nice Art with her partner, Tim Rickett. Her work has been exhibited with Vermont Center of Photography, Lens Scratch, Dec Unu Arts, F-Stop Magazine, and Photo Lucida Critical Mass. So she's shown around some really great locations. Of course, Lens Scratch is a beloved photo blog that everyone should subscribe to. I've been reading their stuff since my undergrad back in 2016, I believe, is when I was introduced to their website. So she's been doing some work with them. She's done some group exhibitions, including the 19th Julia Margaret Cameron Award Show in Barcelona, Spain, the South Dakota Governor's 10th Biennial Art Exhibition, Seeking Balance Artist Books and Typographic Messages in Laramie, Wyoming, among many others, as well as her upcoming show at the Vermont Center for Photography in November, December. Since that is much more local to me than all those other ones, I'm definitely going to be trying to make my way out to go see that show in Vermont. She currently teaches adjunct at USD and NSU South Dakota, as well as Southwest Virginia Community College. Zoom helps a lot with those longer distances, doesn't it? And through her teaching and all that, she and her partner Tim made her collaborative art project called Midwest Nice Art, which just finished up. As I'm recording this, it just finished up their first curated exhibition called A Nice One, and you can look at the online version of that to see some stuff in there. Some really wonderful artwork, not just photography, it's all kind of other stuff. And that was at the NSU JFAC Gallery. So that is a little bit about Epiphany. Of course, she goes into a lot more in-depth things than that. So you guys are all here to hear me talk to Epiphany Knedler. It was a wonderful conversation, great catching up with her. And without anything else left for the logistics side of things, let's get on into the conversation with Epiphany Knedler. All right. Hi, Epiphany. Thank you so much for joining me on the first interview episode in, God, I think over 2 years, technically. It's been a while since the last one was with Brendan Burton, which was an awesome conversation. Could have been 2 episodes, but anyway. introduce yourself and kind of how you first got into photography and art.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. I am an artist and educator. I currently live in Aberdeen, South Dakota, middle of nowhere, up in almost North Dakota. And I'm working as a lecturer of art at Northern State University, and I'm also continuing to adjunct on the side. I'm very interested in Midwestern aesthetics and histories and things like that. My interest in photography really started when I was, I think, a teenager. I started to take my sister got a digital camera for her birthday, and I was jealous of it. So when she wasn't using it, I would go ahead and take it and go around town and take pictures. And I've always been interested in art because both of my parents are artists. They both work as art educators. My mom in K through 8, and my dad is the chair of the art department at the University of South Dakota. So I've always been in the arts in some way. But I didn't really take photography seriously at the beginning as an art form. It was something more that, I used to document the world around me. And it wasn't until, probably a couple years after I started taking pictures that one day my dad took the memory card from that camera and looked through the photos and was like, oh wow, these are really artistic. You have an actual eye for composition and color and whatnot. And I was like, I don't know, they're just pictures, didn't mean anything to me at the time. And he printed them off on these really large, they were 20 by 30 pieces of printmaking paper, and he framed them up and everything. And that was my first moment of seeing my photographs within that art perspective. After that, I didn't want to go into art because who wants to follow in their parents' footsteps? I wanted to focus on politics initially. I went out to Washington, D.C. I worked for my senator while I was at school there and hated it. I did not want to work in an office. I wanted to actually get real things done in the world and not just write letters to appease people. And so I came back to South Dakota and started to study both political science and art, and realized that with art, you can talk about whatever you want to talk about. And so, I started to merge those ideas. And since then, all I've been doing is my photography and fine art. So
I can totally relate with the questioning, following in your parents' footsteps, and I had this kind of similar thing, but I had to kind of veer, it was a sidestep toward what my dad does, because my dad's in public relations and communication.
Oh yeah.
So I got my minor in mass media and journalism, which is toward that, and of course that was originally when I wanted to be a journalist, and a lot of people know how that went. So. But I can totally understand how those early high school days, for a lot of us, I think did your high school have a photo class kind of thing?
We did, but it was tied with the journalism class, and I never took any of those classes. I took one art class while I was in school, but I was in band and choir, and so those fulfilled what I needed. And it was at the same time as some of the AP history and things like that. So I was I can take pictures. It's fine. I don't need a class to do that. Yeah. And look at me now teaching it. So it's important.
Yeah. So I'm really curious, along the lines of school, I'm really curious about, your grad school experience, because you went to East Carolina. Is it East Carolina State or East Carolina University? I always forget.
East Carolina University.
There is no state. It's just East Carolina University.
Yeah.
These darn state schools can never decide when they want to have state in there or not. I mean, Massachusetts, they have Bridgewater State, and then there's Massachusetts is our Commonwealth. It's
not technically
terminology.
A state.
There are very few people that will actually correct you on that out here, and those people, they just need to be quiet. Anyway, so I'm really curious about your experience at ECU, and kind of how, like, I'm especially interested in how your work that you made for your MFA, how that compares or differs from not only your teachers, but also past students, if you're familiar with the past MFA students from there.
Yeah, I think that ECU's photo program is very diverse. If you compare it to other like graduate photo programs, a lot of them you see the instructors there, and the people who end up going there make work that is very similar to that. And so ECU, that's not really the case. The people who, so, you know, my work does have to do with that road trip aesthetic, and it's very formal. The formal qualities are very similar to my photo professor, Daniel Carrico. He has a lot of work that is very formal time documentation of Louisiana, and specifically how that's changing due to climate change. And then my other photo professor, Angela Franks-Wells, she is very interested in ideas of labor and work, and also alt process. And then the other instructor, who was a visiting instructor at the time that I worked with, was Josh Raftery, and his work dealt with alt process, but also very intimate feelings of death, very existential things like that. And so with, you know, already we have a diverse sort of teaching load. And so thinking about that, the people who made work before me, I think that one thing that you can see across everyone who goes to school there is Angela and Daniel really focusing on, like, what kind of work do you personally want to make, and also very much emphasizing that idea of who are you and how do you fit within the world of art and photography, and what are you interested in. And so it's really, you know, developed by who you are, which is fantastic. We get to really choose what we want to focus on, which I know at a lot of schools you don't get to do that quite as much, or they try to push you in certain directions. And with our program, I think that, you know, I spent my first 2 years doing something completely different than the work that I ended up with. I think that happens to a lot of people.
Yeah.
But most of the work that was in my cohort or those before was very focused on, like, family stories, Appalachia, personal, like, you know, mental health struggles, or history has been just a huge thing, whether it's local history or family history, anything within those regards. A lot of content that is focused on, like, exploring alt process as well. But yeah, I think that the program there is, they don't really, you know, tell you this ahead of time, but think about, you know, who are you and how do you fit within these ideas, and you start to figure that out within your own processes.
Yeah, that's it's really interesting, like, how I feel like a lot of the state universities, I feel like, at least the ones that I've observed, have a very similar kind of structure, because that's kind of how the master's students in my undergrad, that's kind of what their experience generally was. Mm-hmm. It's been a while since I actively talked to my friend Anthony Hamilton, who was an MFA. Actually, he was technically a painting MFA, but he also did animation and photography and video. So he just kind of was like, I'm just here doing what I want. And they rolled with it. They allowed him to kind of have fun with it. And he's been doing some work up in Chicago and all that. But then, you know, my master's school here in Massachusetts, you know, it's like, if I were to talk to anyone I know that is involved with the private schools in Providence and Boston, I've always been curious about how different or even similar the private schools are, because it seems like the state schools, generally speaking, have that kind of holistic approach to letting the Mass Juice students do what they want with a certain kind of like, you know, guidance along, like we're these 20 and 30-year-olds that are trying to figure out what we're doing.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely true. I've mostly been in the state system, and I do notice that when people do go to those like art schools, you know, specifically for art, or private schools or anything along those lines, a lot of times I don't know if it's, you know, the instructors are a little bit more strict, or if they want to focus a little bit more on the conceptual nature of things, or what exactly, but it does seem like they have a little bit more of a say in molding who comes out of the programs.
Yeah, it's like there's a reputation that Yale has to maintain. That's why we have all the Yale girls from the 90s, and granted, we love them. They're wonderful. Yes, I have no problems with any of them. Was Justine Curlin one of them? I think she was. I can't remember. There's any of those like got their MFA in the 80s and 90s women photographers are probably from Yale.
Probably.
But anyway, so with all that, like I remember, gosh, back in the dark days of COVID, the early days of COVID, I remember I was working on my first curated zine that you had submitted to. And I remember that photo that was the stuff on the sidewalk. Mm-hmm. That was not part of your MFA, right?
No, that was actually my undergrad show.
Wow, that wasn't
way back.
Because there was the second curated one that had one from your MFA.
Yes. Yeah.
So that was when I was starting to pay more attention to like kind of the work of people that were in there. And I was a lot more picky about things, but I still loved them. But I remember seeing the installation photos as you were getting ready, but then the world blew up. Yes. So having graduated in 2020, the unlucky year, among so many students that had a COVID-19 affected graduation, it affected your thesis exhibition, obviously. But how did you navigate that? Like, what exactly was the process of dealing with such an uncertain time that year?
Yeah, I think that I have definitely made the best of it with what we were given. So just to set the scene for everyone, a week before our schools shut down, we had, so all of the MFA grads, we had to put our show up by that, was it Monday, I believe, before spring break. So I got everything put up. If anyone hasn't seen it, you know, it's a pretty hefty installation in terms of like how much I hand painted the wood paneling on the walls. So it's not real wood paneling. It's all the fake wood texture and whatnot. So it was a lot of work. It was really fun though. I loved doing it. And then my parents both visited from South Dakota to see it during spring break. Another super weird thing at the time was that the school, ECU, was closed not due to COVID that week, but because we had a bat infestation, which...
Of all things.
What?
Wasn't there a
yes,
working theory that COVID was from bats?
Yes, and so people were extra scared, you know, the few weeks after that. There's not... They've solved it. You can go to school there. You won't get bitten by bats, I promise. But super weird. So, like, the school was already closed because of that. And then what was it, like a day after my dad was there, he got the news from his school that, hey, we're shutting down for a couple of weeks while we figure stuff out. And
couple of weeks.
Yes, which obviously turned into more. Then we got the email that said, again, it'll be at least a week. Okay, it's going to be the rest of the semester. And so with that, you know, it was pretty disappointing for everyone who had their show because we were all so excited to show off what we've been working on for 3 years. And luckily, the people who I wanted to definitely see it got to see it. So that's wonderful. And I was also able to, after the school was like officially, closing and whatnot, the gallery had a week to figure things out, and they had decided that we were just going to have everything up still, and then, again, see where things go, because we didn't know this was going to be that big of a thing. But they allowed the grad students to come in and take photos of our work, just to make sure we got good documentation. So it was fantastic that they were thinking ahead like that, and not just, oh, well, whatever happens, doesn't matter. So with that documentation, it was fantastic, because I think that the art and specifically the photo community really came together during that time, and I had, I think, a lot more opportunities to share my work than I otherwise would have. There were a lot of online exhibitions and things. There was one, I think it was called just MFA thesis, and then they would have a year after it, and they would share work from that online. There was the through SPE, the Photo Fika trading card kind of thing too.
Oh
Yeah, that's pretty fun. And that's actually how I got connected with Aline Smithson at Lens Scratch, and I've been working with her quite a bit. Super excited when I saw that she chose my work to review. And then other than that, a really cool thing was they had this Instagram account called the Social Distance Gallery, and I cannot remember off the top of my head who ran that, but it was one person that ran it and was like, there are so many exhibitions that are, BFA, MFA, whatever it may be, that no one gets to see now, and so, send in your work and show it to us. And something really cool with that was Art News did an article about that, and a screenshot of my installation was on it too. So I was like, yes, I'm in Art News. It was just their weekly roundup thing, but I'm counting it. So
hey, that counts.
Yeah.
Did you get a credit in the byline on the cut line?
It did say, work by Epiphany Knedler. So.
Nice.
But
love that.
Yeah, I think that I was able to get my work shown quite a few more places. I also met online, virtually met quite a few more people who were graduating the same year as me that otherwise I would have just been, focused on my own artist talks and, the thesis paper, all of those kinds of things. And instead, we were at home online figuring out how we can share our own work, but, connect with others as well. And so I do think that it was ultimately for my work a positive, since I think there were more eyes on it than there otherwise would have been.
Yeah. Now, I've been really trying to find opportunities like that for my own sake, but also just kind of observing. And I don't know if it's just me, but I feel like those online exhibitions have kind of dwindled quite a bit in just the past 2 to 3 years. It seemed like after 2021 was coming to a close, was when we were kind of going away from that, and a lot of that accessibility had kind of vanished. Because it's like, oh, COVID's over. It's not over, people. Yes. It still exists.
I agree with that. And I think that a lot of people are trying their hardest just to get their work shown physically, but also those who were doing the online curation and things like that. One thing I think that probably attributes to it is burnout, of, trying to show as many things as possible. It is a lot of work to do that stuff online too. But I think that people are trying to get back into that, physical connection. But, again, that's kind of, I'm sure we'll talk about it at some point, but why we decided to create Midwest Nice Art, to have more of that accessibility and virtual exhibitions and things.
Yeah. That's kind of like what I've hoped to have Sadbird turn into as well, but of course that takes a lot of time and effort and obviously money. And I am but one person, but that's how it goes. That's one thing that I've learned in a good way, that I've learned the hard way, that there's that amount of collaboration and cooperation. So when it comes to the installation of your work, since you mentioned that there was a lot of handmade stuff for that, and the title of it, Wish You Were Here, it's got this really, really lovely rustic and contemporary styling, meshing together, which I absolutely love, because you'll have that like hand painted wall, like the faux wood, and then you'll have this mural on the wall that's like a very clean, modern kind of thing. I absolutely love that.
Thank you.
And then the styling is all like, it's using the road trip as the method. So it's like this kind of vernacular, while also like, I think I wrote in here that it feels like you're looking at the walls of a local bar littered with photos of the town's history, but it's actually photos from around the country. And then those large murals and that kind of starkness. I'm really curious about how you kind of went about developing that idea for the installation.
So I think that a lot of it, before I had this exact idea for what I was going to do, I proposed to my thesis committee that I want to do something that is about Midwestern stories, specifically roadside attractions, the way that we engage with them, but I want it all to have like the aesthetic of my great grandma's house.
Yeah.
And so, I think about that Midwestern aesthetic, especially because being in North Carolina, it's a very different aesthetic when it is more of that older, more vintage kind of aesthetic. It's very different than what you see in the Midwest. Because in the Midwest, you go to the Eagles Club, for example.
Oh, yep. I've never set foot in one in my life, but I drive past them all the time.
We would have a lot of events there in my childhood. Very strange. But, it's always that wood paneling. It has the images on the walls of, what veterans, or if it is, at a local bar or something, patrons or history. And so that was my general aesthetic idea for it. And I didn't, figure out what that was going to actually look like until probably 5 months after I took the pictures, to be honest.
Yeah.
And it's very reminiscent of Waldrug, South Dakota. So Waldrug is this... It's a drugstore technically, but it takes up almost the entirety of Wall, South Dakota. It's a very, very small town, and their main street is just tourist shop after tourist shop. Very all over the place in terms of what they sell and things like that. But essentially this family, the Husteds, decided to move there in early 20th century because they wanted a place that they could, send their kids to school but still live in the same town and all of those things. They decided to stop there because it's about an hour and a half from the Badlands and Mount Rushmore. So it's that, journey west. We think about that. And inside the main restaurant, it basically looks like the way that I've made my installation. So it is that wood paneling. There's images all over, fake prints of cowboys in the West, those very idealized versions, romanticized Western history. So I had that idea, but at the same time, I've been very interested in installation since I was in undergrad. My undergrad show played a lot with the idea of blowing up your photographs to be life size, starting to put objects with them to create that, talk about that space that, you're compressing a space in a photograph, and how can you create a space in a gallery with that. So I'd used this vinyl adhesive paper before, and I was thinking about it, and I wanted to include it in some fashion, especially thinking about the work and how it's all about the way that we as tourists at these attractions engage with history. So, thinking about, well, why do you go to a roadside attraction? Oftentimes it's because you want to get your picture taken with that thing to post on Instagram, but also for a lot of people, it's a way to feel like, so-and-so stood here and I'm now part of the history they were part of. So I was interested in that, and then I was also thinking about the gallery and installation as another experience, and how can I create essentially a roadside attraction, completing the same things that a roadside attraction does, enticing visuals, and things for people to actually like sit with and feel like they're a part of, participate with in some way. So I think installation is a great way to talk about that and think about that gallery experience and who your viewer is, who your audience is, or how you want them to act within your space. So yeah, then I decided to have those be large, essentially mural prints. I wanted to keep that as more of the contemporary aesthetic, just because I felt like the contrast was nice. I didn't want to, make it too overwhelmingly gold frames, kitschy, whatever it may be. It already is, but but yeah, that's sort of how it developed over time. It's been an ongoing process figuring out, when you have a site-specific installation like that, how can you show that in other galleries? And so that's been something I've been continuing to experiment with quite a bit. I've had a show in Sioux Falls, South Dakota at the Washington Pavilion, and I recreated that with the vinyl prints, and then I redid just one large wall with actual wood paneling and put all of those images up salon style. And I'm still trying to figure out how the one at the Vermont Center for Photography is going to look. Each place is different, and
if you need help, how to do that. I'm a few hours drive away.
Yeah, I might.
Depending on where in Vermont. Actually, where is it in Vermont?
It is Brattleboro. I'm not sure where that is, because I am not up on my...
I need to remind... Vermont, that is like right on the border of New Hampshire and Vermont, and that's southern, which is good, which means it's closer to me.
Nice.
That's probably only about a 3-hour drive away rather than a 6-hour drive, which almost gets me to Canada.
Oh, gosh.
But yeah, so I've been really interested in, like, especially how your approach to, like, tourism and all that is, like, really present in the kinds of images that are in here, from like looking at them, just one image after the other on your website or Instagram versus also seeing the installation photos. I really enjoy like how you brought in like that so-and-so stood here, I'm part of this history by being in the same spot. It instantly brought me back to when I was in the Grand Tetons back in 2018. And they have the Snake River overlook, if I might have that slightly off, but like that big paved thing where Ansel Adams took one of his famous Snake River photos. And it's a beautiful image, of course. Ansel Adams, there's very little bad to say about him, and he had some very, very interesting things to say about photography and art at that time. But it was really interesting that I took like a cropped in version of what he had done, and we had eerily similar weather conditions. Like the same kind of like fair weather clouds, like with a lot of backlight and punchiness to the contrast. So I was like, other than the fact that mine wasn't a super wide angle shot, I was like more like 45, 50 millimeter on a full frame. It was still like kind of really interesting that I'm like, oh yeah, I'm here in a very different condition, very different time as Ansel Adams, in this designed for tourists to take that same picture.
Yes.
It's always been super fascinating to me. And some of the subjects that you have in your installation in the show are either kind of like off-angle views that have a famous structure, monument, whatever, or even like the one of Carhenge is one of course, I feel like a lot of people's favorite because it's freaking Carhenge.
Yes.
But I'm really, really interested in how that all, like, when it came to like choosing what photos to include, and possibly even when you're on your trips, like how you approach those different scenes, because some photographers will take like one picture and that'll be it, and then sometimes they'll just take a million pictures in one spot to kind of feel things out.
Yeah, I think that I'm sort of a combination of those two things. So I'm very interested first and foremost in the formal composition. That is usually what brings me to whatever it is. to pick out the places that I decided to take pictures, I think the main thing that drove me as a grad student was, where can I stay for free or almost free?
Yes.
So that was a big thing. And with my partner, Tim Rickett, being from Nebraska, we were able to make this road trip pretty easily without spending a ton of money, because we were able to stay with family. But so when it came to the actual attractions themselves, I had a list of the ones I 100% wanted to stop at. Carhenge actually initially wasn't on the list because I hadn't ever heard of it, and Tim said, oh no, we need to stop there. It's in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing else there. It's really weird. And I am so happy we did. But yeah, when I'm actually out taking the photos, I think that really, while I was taking the photos, I wasn't quite sure what I was going to be talking about, what kind of commentary about those ideas of how we engage with history and things along those lines. It was more focused on the story that creates these roadside attractions. Initially, I was very interested in the idea of general infrastructure that was created throughout the Midwest in order to allow people to go from the East Coast to the West Coast. So that was sort of a driving factor first, and then I looked up, what are the oldest roadside attractions? Why did some of these pop up? A lot of these smaller towns in the Midwest also a lot of them don't have something specific that they're known for, and so they'll create something in order to create, that traction and get people to come there.
It's just bringing me to Route 66 with when I was originally working on a Route 66 project, and that had been dissolved, where the photos exist but they're in something else now. And that was something that I saw in a lot of the towns in Illinois, because obviously Chicago, they really don't care that it's Route 66. It's freaking Chicago. No. There's more interesting things to do. But as you get out of Joliet, between Joliet and Bloomington, and then between Bloomington, Springfield, and between Springfield and St. Louis, those middle points have these little tiny towns from a range of, triple-digit populations to maybe a low 10,000 to 15,000 if you're lucky, and that'll be their whole shtick is Route 66, and that's what we got. We got the giants, we got the diners, which are generally pretty good, because they've probably been around for a while, but then they just really honed in on the Route 66 part of it, and that's been something that's so fascinating to me about that small town Midwestern aesthetic, because I feel like small towns on the East Coast versus small towns on the West Coast, they're you got the Midwest and then you got the coasts that have distinctly different small town vibes, and the Midwest I feel has exactly what you're describing of we got to make something about it. There's nothing else here. We got to make something up. Yeah,
that's something too. I was just thinking about when I was in North Carolina, people would, when you move somewhere else, they're always well, where are you from? And I say, South Dakota. And they say, where is that? What is there? Why do you live there?
I can't blame you for leaving.
Yeah. Always. And so that was what really prompted the project was my instructors, going back to that idea of how they, what sort of prompts we were given with this kind of stuff. And really, ultimately, they said, why are you doing photography? What is driving you, and what's your, goal? And so I went back and was okay, well, let's think about who I am, how do I define myself? And a lot of it is the idea that I'm from rural South Dakota, where no one knows what is there. And so if people know of South Dakota, they think of Mount Rushmore.
Yeah.
That's about it.
If they even know that Mount Rushmore is in South Dakota at all.
Yes.
Same thing with Devil's Tower.
Yeah, they think it's in, Wyoming or Montana or something.
No, granted, it's not too far away, but
no,
still.
It's not, but...
It's in the interesting part of South Dakota.
Yes, because this side... flat, there's nothing here, but thinking about some of those ideas, is really what drove the project, thinking like, what do outsiders think of South Dakota?
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's kind of similar to how I approached my MFA. Was like, when it comes to like the navigation of like things like that, I started very personal, and I started like, okay, I just moved across the country, and this is the first time I've made this big of a move, and things feel kind of funky, and I had this weird relationship with the idea of home, so I'm like, okay, let's figure all that out. And over the 2 years of my MFA, it like completely changed. And I'm really curious. So like, I know for me and a handful of other artists that work in a similar method to you and me, did your I say method like aesthetic and such, not method. Did a lot of the images, were those road trips planned for the sake of making the work, or were they kind of like we're gonna go on these trips and then kind of whatever photos kind of happen to come across, this kind of roll with the punches, and then after getting back, it's like, let's sift through things and make something out of it?
Yeah, I think so. Before this specific project, back to South Dakota from North Carolina, that's how I always made my work, was just, I'm going to have my camera with me, I'm going to go to this place, I'm going to explore what's there, and that was, how the images were made. There wasn't a full, something I struggle with is trying to make too many rules for myself ahead of time, or saying this is what this is going to be about, so I'm only looking for XYZ in terms of supporting my thesis statement that I've come up with for this project. And so in the past, normally it's just go out, take photos, look through them later, figure out what the theme is. But with this project, I did know that I was doing this road trip specifically to take the photos. And so I had really the only like specific ideas that I had that were driving me were where I'm stopping in terms of, Mount Rushmore, Crazy Horse, Corn Palace, etc. Yeah. World's only Corn Palace.
Bloomington Normal has I forget what baseball league they're in. It's not minor league. I think it's a step down from minor league. And the name of the stadium is the Corn Crib.
Oh, I love that. I can't remember
the exact. I can't remember the Corn Belters, I think is what they were called.
That's great.
Yeah,
that's
wonderful.
Fantastic.
I've never been to a game, but I've kind of always wanted to go.
I feel like I need a t-shirt of that now, too.
Oh, you can probably find it.
Yeah.
Illinois Corn Belters.
So that was really the only thing that was driving all of it, was like those specific places to stop. Other than that, there wasn't anything in terms of like I didn't have any specific pictures in my head of how things were going to look. And so really I honestly don't even know how many photos I took. It was a lot.
Yeah.
I still need to go through all of them, to be honest.
You probably beat the crap out of my quantity. I had like maybe just shy of 400 grand total shot in consideration for my MFA.
I don't know. I had, I think I had 300 that I originally picked out that I was like, these might be in it. We'll see. But, there's way more than that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just thinking of like the 400 some that I like. Those are the ones I knew about. Those are also like of like unique scenes. Those are the number of unique scenes. So like I bet you probably have like thousands of files and whatever.
Yes, it's a lot. And so then after that, I sort of dug through those and picked out. These are the ones that there's quite a few of them that I think when you look at them, you're like, oh yeah, I can see why this one was chosen because of, whether it's the thing in the background, the way people are interacting with it, the color, whatever it is. So that's sort of like my general process for that project.
Yeah, and I know like one thing that I remember a while ago when I was reading kind of your statement about Wish You Were Here, that you try to keep your photos as unedited as possible from like exceptions of like the absolute basic things. And I found, especially because I've become so familiar with old Kodachromes with my day job, that when there's a good Kodachrome, a good Ektachrome, one that hasn't faded, like they look incredible. They look like a digital photo from the 70s or whatever. And a lot of the photos that you have, based on how you shot them and how you minimally edited them, actually kind of has that feeling. I think that really, really helps emphasize the goal that you had in the series, because it's like a lot of those old slides from the 70s and 80s and even the 60s, you know, was like the early-ish days of like American tourism really just being the way it is as we kind of romanticize it as. And I think that was that intentional to kind of go for a kind of like Kodachrome slide look, or was that just kind of like a latent, that's how it worked out?
I think that it wasn't my like 100% intention to go about that. I think that it sort of, that aesthetic like lends itself to this subject matter very easily. And when you think about when you go to antique stores and things and you look through their postcards or their slides or whatever they have, I love collecting those when they have the really nice color or some sort of roadside attraction thing in them. So I think that it just kind of was the nature of the aesthetic that lent itself to that subject, but also that's how I've done most of my images. I don't really highly edit anything. I edit for color. Lately, in a couple of my newer series, I've been accentuating that sort of color film look without having to pay for color film because it's expensive. So
any listeners that want to buy my color film, please let me know. I will sell it to you. That is not a joke. That is an advertisement.
So I think that it would have been very cool if I would have been able to afford that, to take all of my pictures with color film and really accentuate some of those ideas, or some of that more experimental film that acts almost like Kodachrome and things.
Oh yeah, and like the closest you can get these days is like Ektachrome, which is great.
Yeah,
but
yes,
it's not the same
It's not the same.
They're like, when people say that Kodachrome had a look, they're not lying.
Yes, it is very specific. So I tend to just edit for color and contrast and brightness and just those super, super basic things.
Yep.
And not a lot more than that, just because I like that traditional, like, formal aesthetic. I'm very in that new topographics era. Yes.
new topographics. Yeah, and it's like, since a lot of the images you have, I think a lot, if not all of them, are shot in like midday. There's that like bright blue sky or whatever is presently available.
Yes, and that's something that, like, I think that is, that's something I've always done, and it's very controversial in terms of when I talk to other people, like, about my photographs, because a lot of them are like, oh, you really need to either wake up earlier or go during that golden hour and blah, 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 and I'm of the mindset where, like, however I find it is how I'm going to, make that image. I don't... There's certain images where, you do kind of have to do that, but mine, I don't know. I don't do that. I'm very much of, this is how reality is for whoever is in this space at this time, and this is how things actually look. And yeah, that was a very controversial thing within my thesis as well, having certain people say, these need to have that more beautiful light rather than it looks like it's right after lunch or whatever.
I'm on your side in this.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a tough thing to go about, because like I shot a lot of photos in the middle of the day. I had like a whole range of times a day in my MFA, but everything from dark photos out of a airplane window to literally just going to Mattapoisett one afternoon and just taking a picture of a big ass iced puddle on the ground. Anyway, so like with with a lot of your work overall, like from your MFA in undergrad to now, I have to always ask every single Midwestern artist that I know, like, or photographer especially, is do you believe that there is like a Midwestern accent in photography? Not just the aesthetic, but an accent to it. And if so, how would you personally define what that would be?
I love that you phrased it as an accent. That's something that we talk about a lot, because like if you're in Dakota, like the Dakotas or Minnesota, you likely have an accent. I'm the only one in my family that has like a South Dakotan accent as well, which is really weird. But yes, there is 100% an accent that exists for Midwestern photographers. And I think, man, I don't really know how you would like define it necessarily, because it's definitely based on the aesthetics. I also think that I've noticed a lot of like brown or yellow ochre in a lot of people's work. Yeah. And that's very much these towns developed through the 80s, and everything was brown in the 80s, and then the towns didn't revitalize in any fashion. And so I think that might be part of why we are so drawn to some of those colors and things like that. And I think that a lot of people, if you live in the Midwest, if you're not in a bigger city, Minneapolis, Kansas City, Chicago, wherever, you usually try to leave, at least, get out there. And so then I think that there's a lot of people who have that sort of like homesick feeling, whether they realize it's from, most don't end up moving back to small town South Dakota, unlike me. But I think that is sort of a form of comfort for a lot of people, or it's a way of exploring, again, those ideas of who you are as an artist, maybe even exploring some, family issues or trauma or things like that. I think that that accent shows up a lot of because of those reasons. We try to get away, and then we do some introspection and realize visually how we can communicate some of those ideas.
Yeah, I think I've also seen from the bigger name Midwestern photographers, like obviously Alex Soth and Tim Carpenter, who I met at Chico, who's a wonderful human being. I have his book sitting over there. But like of some of the more well-known Midwestern photographers, like even them compared to us lowly peons that are just kind of finding our footing in the world. One thing that's like I've seen that's really consistent is that there's a kind of quietness and like I wouldn't want to say subtle, but like there's a kind of poetic quality to a lot of the Midwestern that seems to be much more present in like Middle American photographers. And then if you look at both coasts, most of California is like really punchy. There's a lot of like, at least from what I've seen online and through books I have and everything, like I have Katie Grannon's The 9 and 99 over there. Wonderful work and really, really interesting. But one of the portraits of the people, like super intense, not only color but also light quality. And over here it's like things are like really, they seem to be kind of dramatic in the Northeast, rightfully so, I would say. I feel like they gotta get their emotions out somehow. And I feel like Appalachia has probably the closest kind of aesthetic toward the Midwest. And I think that there's a lot of really interesting stuff that like Stacey Kranitz is especially interested in her work that I think does a really good job representing some. Of course, she's being a pretty big name artist, but of the other Appalachian photographers I know that are younger and still figuring stuff out, like there is that kind of like somewhere between the East Coast drama and the Midwestern I'm really tired vibe.
Yes.
and that, I mean, yeah. So I think that's really what's interesting. And you mentioned about like a lot of Midwesterners will try to get out of their small town, and of course that's what I did. And I do want to wind up in Chicago one day, but that's no real thing. So I guess you've kind of touched on it a little bit, but I guess I'm really curious about how, like, what your perspective is on why you chose to stay in a relatively small town in South Dakota rather than, finding yourself in Sioux Falls or even Minneapolis.
Yeah, so I think that most of the reason for being here is because I graduated during 2020. We were both very much like, well, what do we do now? I don't know. There wasn't anything keeping us in North Carolina necessarily. And Tim had some health issues as well. So we decided to move closer to family and be there, in case something were to happen, which luckily it didn't. But with that, we moved to Sioux Falls, South Dakota first, and we lived there for 2 years. And it was really nice to be close to family again after we both had been away for so long. Me 3 years, Tim 4 years, and it was mostly just nice to be back in. I feel at home when I have that really stretch of plains where you can see almost to where the earth curves. I feel like it's just you go out to the fields and you can see everything and you feel like you're the only person for miles and miles, and I really like that feeling. I know some people who grow up in big Cities hate that and they feel almost claustrophobic being out there. But I really enjoy it. I think that was one thing that brought us back. The reason we have stayed is primarily for job security, if we're being totally honest.
That's a big part of it these days.
Yeah, both being educators, it's difficult to find a place where you can, both work in higher ed as well. So we've been really lucky with that. Other than that, a big reason for us staying here and making the work that we're making is we're just very interested in that romanticization of the West, the stories, the legends, all of those things, the aesthetics. I know you can see it behind me, but I have a big stuffed pheasant that we found at Goodwill. Where else are you going to find a pheasant at Goodwill in America? So for $10. So
yeah.
So there's a lot of those kinds of things that, we stay here for that. But, we'll see where we go after that. I think that, though, staying here, we're able to make the work that we need to make. Another great thing that I always tell people, because a lot of people, especially in the arts, are unsure if they would like to be in a rural area, is, we have a local airport. We're 3 hours away from a larger airport. We're 5 or 6 hours from Minneapolis. So anywhere we need to go, we can. But here we're able to afford a house. We've bought a house, which is almost unheard of for someone that's 28. and
these days especially too. Yes.
And we have studio space. We have, a yard for our dogs. I don't know. You can afford quite a bit here is another great thing. And then when we need to go, do anything to look at contemporary art, we know where to go to do that. So that's sort of the things that keep us here. But of course we miss I liked when I did live in an actual big city. I really enjoyed it, constantly having people to look at and things to do. And so there are a lot of days that I miss that as well.
Yeah, that's something that I went to New York City for the first time back in July, and I always would joke about how much I hate New York City, even though I've never been there before, kind of thing. And it was such an interesting thing. So we did go to Chelsea, where the main art district and everything, and I dropped off some film at Picture House in the Small Darkroom. Wonderful, wonderful people over there. It was awesome knowing I could get real contact prints off of film, regardless of color and black and white. Big fan of that. And it wasn't even that expensive too, but that's a That's Sasha Wolf's advertisement. We don't need to plug her sponsor. And I didn't even use that discount. So, like, when I was in Chelsea, it was such a strange thing because a couple of my friends that I was visiting study in New York. One goes to Parsons, one goes to SVA, and then two of my other friends went to school in Tennessee, and now one's going to school at Virginia Commonwealth, and the other, I forget where she's going. And then another one of my friends that was there, he dropped out of college, and he doesn't really have that kind of art education background. And just kind of like us, like, not from the city, and being with the two that are in the city, not from the city, it was such a strange, and I'm not sure if it was a good or bad thing, but it was really weird just being like surrounded, like every block there was like a million galleries, and like up in Boston there's a similar thing. I forget the name of the immediate area, but there's this string of galleries and stuff, and I'm like, this is strange. I feel like it all being concentrated in one spot of the city seems counterproductive, because there's these amazing small galleries, like there's Gallery 263 in Cambridge, and I love them up there. Wonderful people. And then there's the I can't remember. Gosh dang it! It's a photo museum up in Manchester. I just can't remember the name of it, and I'm really struggling. I'll fix that later. I'll put it on the video version of this. But like those kind of spaces are like those ones that are further out of the city. Like they also have like such bigger spaces to work with, I've found, and like a lot of the inner city ones are like so little, unless it's like a really heavily funded space. But that's aside from the point. You did touch briefly on the kind of work that you and Tim have been making lately. I mean, is most of the work that you've been making, is it really focused on the collaborative stuff, or are you guys still kind of doing your own solo stuff as well?
We are still doing our own stuff too. Our collaborative stuff really started when we moved back to South Dakota. The South Dakota Arts Council has some really nice grants that they give out, and being that it's not that big of a state, people who have recently moved have a pretty good chance of showing that they're, dedicated and everything like that. So we applied for this artist collaborative grant in 2021, and we received it. We had work that we were planning to do that was about like the lost legends of South Dakota. So all of the stories that are untold, all of the things that of the basic stories of like General Custer or Mount Rushmore in general and things like that, but what are the other stories that aren't as well known? So that was our like starting point for that. And we were really interested in, there are a couple of artists, like Nixon Gerber were one that we were interested in. They came to ECU while we were both at school there. And Tim makes a lot of small sculptures, and he's really interested in that, like, miniatures aesthetic. But he's also interested in ideas of, like, reuse and the life of an object and what kind of history it holds. So we were interested in combining those things with photography. So it started off with like making versions of those stories. One of my favorites, I think my favorite from our first iteration of that series, is called Outlaw Horses of the Badlands. And it's about, it's a piece that is mostly red. All the horses are red. And they're these little miniature horses that we painted. And then we made a little sort of like paper diorama almost of the Badlands. And so we, took that picture. It was also very in line with like Wendy Red Star's work as well. Very bright, and the horses too. So with that, that story is about how in the early 20th century, when a lot of farms, and I think that late 1800s as well, there were a lot of farms that were going under because of economics and things like that. And so they couldn't take care of their horses anymore. And so farmers would bring their horses to the Badlands and just like leave them there. And so before, I think it was 1940, the Badlands was like overrun with these horses that were like half domesticated, half not. There were a few that were like the leaders, and they would just take all the other horses in. So it wasn't really like, it was a tourist attraction in terms of it's a natural space, but it wasn't technically a national park yet. And so once it became a national park officially, they had to like drive the horses out of the area. That's a whole nother story. But, you know, thinking about some of those things and how that sort of defines our local histories or regional histories is really interesting. So that's sort of where we started. The work has really developed over time and transformed. And so we've sort of, there's a few pieces that we continue to like both touch in some manner, but they're not as like 100% collaborative as the first few pieces were. We sort of are both working on our own things, and they have at least one story or aesthetic that connects them in some way.
Yeah. Is that, just to make sure, is that kind of the Here in the Mysterious Elsewhere series, is that connected to that in that way?
Yes. So Here in the Mysterious Elsewhere is sort of, it's like 3 different iterations of that project together. We showed it for the first time this past May at the University of South Dakota, John A. Day Gallery. And it's, so the photos that have an object that's red and have that much more small sculpture, a picture of a small sculpture mentality, those are the first iteration. And then we have the collages as well, and then and Tim's smaller sculptures that are a lot of the horses. And then we have some newer work that are these little found cowboys with this like circle around them as well, and those are the newest version of that thing. It's constantly evolving, and it's definitely just about that overall romanticization of the area and the stories and the people, and some subtle conversations and comments about what's currently going on here socially and politically.
Yeah. I was really curious about how the line of progress, because it's such a, like, for being generally aesthetically very consistent, it also has so many different little things going on. So hearing about that progression of how that work kind of got to where it is now and where it's going in the future is like really, really fascinating. I mean, I especially love, like, there's 2 like non-photo things that I love dearly, and that is collages that utilize text and photos, and just simply how text looks on a page. And if I were not a photographer, I would be doing something along those lines.
Yeah.
Which, granted, I could still absolutely do that. There's nothing stopping me. But I like, one of my favorite things about this series is like you're kind of having this, like, of course, the romanticization of the West, but there's also that you mentioned the Midwestern mythology, and that's something I think that goes back to what we talked about before with like small towns trying to grasp onto something to make it seem like, hey, we're interesting. And then there's always like some really interesting problems that come about that. And I'll go back to like the Route 66 thing, that there's some pretty dark history about Route 66 that some of these towns don't want to acknowledge. And I think that the way that you and Tim have been kind of working on these different myths, ideas, and all that about the Midwest and the West before the mountains is really fascinating, and how like there's clearly like a color symbolism. And there's this one photo I'm looking at on my screen right now that is the little pink cowboy with the circle in the back has like the pink trees and grass, and then there's the river going through it, and that instantly takes me to the aerochrome, which was used for war. And it's like, look, we got symbolism. I love that kind of thing that's been going about it. And there's a kind of playfulness. So it's like, it feels strange in a really, really cool way.
I think that we've both had conversations about this, because both of Tim's MFA work was very much about the environment and climate change, specifically about how, certain environmental disasters that oil companies and places like DuPont and, single-use plastics, all of that kind of stuff, how that is affecting the world today, but also how can an artist work with those ideas and around those ideas. And that's where reusing older materials in his work became something that was very prominent. Also manipulating those things to look like something else. And then my work before my MFA work was also very, very heavy with political ideas. It was all about gentrification, and it made me really depressed. And so basically both of us had this moment where we were like, okay, this work is very important, but it's making the rest of our life it's hard to carry all of that weight and that knowledge, and knowing that you're working towards an idea, but you're not able to actually change anything about it necessarily. You can change maybe a couple people's minds or create a conversation. But if you're not able to really do anything about it, it's just making you very, emotionally unstable, we'll say.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why I can't do any work about public infrastructure or anything like that, because it would just make me angry the whole time because there's nothing I can do.
Yes, because then you have all of this knowledge about, well, here is why the history is this way. A lot of it has to do with, racism or, the working class not getting what they need, the rich always being the ones in control, et cetera, et cetera. We see enough of that in our daily life, I think. And ultimately, I can't change anything about a lot of those bigger conversations. But what I can change, or at least make comments about, is the way that we interpret these historic stories, how we can bring some of those things up to have more, have conversations that are about our history and figure out how they're influencing us in today's society, especially living in a very red state. Thinking about some of these stories and understanding why people think a certain way about something, and maybe shedding light on a perspective that they didn't see or didn't know existed, can be helpful and is something that is within my ability. I suppose. With that being said, there are ways to playfully make this work, whether it's the cowboy, for example, is a big symbol in so many of our works because he represents this, that Midwestern, stoicness. There's a lot of, especially men here, that, I don't show any emotion at all. I do my job. I work with my hands. I provide for my family. That's it. And I think that a lot of the cowboys have that. A lot of people see them as symbols for that. But there's a lot of nuance within the idea of the cowboy as well, especially in contemporary culture. I don't know if you're familiar with Orville Peck, but he's a country singer who he wears a mask, almost like a Zorro mask.
Yeah. I feel like I've seen photos of him.
I'm sure you have. He's big within that sort of alternative country scene. And he, has a lot to say about LGBTQ plus culture, and how so much of that culture is derived from very extravagant, Western culture. How this mentality of the cowboy or the Western figure started, a lot of it with you think of Roy Rogers, very, bedazzled cowboy hats, outfits, but, still known as this tough cowboy figure. over time, it's sort of transformed into something completely different, representative of a different population. And so then, a lot of this that we see today is commenting on some of those ideas. And so, we can create some of those visually appealing stories and have some of those more playful aspects that also something that the average Midwesterner can come to and have something that they either enjoy about it or something they want to comment on about it or, recognize a figure within it, while we're also having a totally different conversation about the way that this culture has developed over time.
Now, I'm really curious with how you guys have been collaborating on these ideas and all that. Of course, it led to the creation of your, I still don't know what to call it exactly, but the Midwest Nice Art thing. I've been referring to it as an art collective, but I'm not sure if that's quite the right thing.
We have sort of been calling it a collective, and the reason that I want to consider it a collective is because, while we created it, every couple of months we bring someone new in to it to jury our shows and have a conversation about what they're doing. So they become part of it too. The people who are in our shows can be part of it as well and have a say in, what we do, what our goals are. But we're still so new that who knows?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I've seen some really cool, iterations of that kind of structure. I know Ed Pinar and Melissa Cantonese have their own down in Pittsburgh. I say down, it's more like over for here. Because we're about the same. Yeah, they're a little bit further south. I know that Irina Rozovsky has the one down in Atlanta. So these little kind of they're in some kind of good central hub kind of thing. But I love seeing those being more common because I feel like that is kind of filling the place that our loss of online exhibitions and things like that, and these spaces are starting to make that third place for artists to go to. But I'm really curious about how that got started. Was that before, during, or after you guys started collaborating on your actual artwork?
That was probably about the same time, I think. So this Midwest Nice Art started as first a way for us to make our work more accessible to the general public. And so really it started with us, it started as a shop, which is weird to think about it because it has transformed to be something completely different. But we were making and selling these little, a lot of resin art. That was what we were doing a lot of during the pandemic. And that's where we made these little resin coasters that had cowboys in them and things that were really fun. So we started to collaborate in that sense. But then over time it was this isn't really our fine art. It's not really it's something we enjoy doing, but it's not really doing anything that we would like it to be doing. So really it wasn't until I think honestly summer of 2022 that we started really thinking about, we are living in South Dakota for the foreseeable future. There is not a huge art population here. There's a hub in Sioux Falls, and there's a lot of really great artists there. But outside of that, you have to travel a good 3 to 6 hours to get to more of an art hub. So with that in mind, how can we create ways for contemporary art to be more accessible and equitable, and bring it to the rural environment?
Yeah.
So I had a little bit of free time somehow in my teaching schedule. I made free time for it. And after when school started last year, we had been talking about this already. What if we made a group that had calls for art? We knew of a couple of our friends had kind of been doing that already with either online shows or local physical shows. And we were thinking about it and said, well, why can't we make something that is technically open to everyone, that's available online? We don't have to manage a physical space, a physical gallery. We don't have to, all we have to pay for is the website and the data storage of the work, which is not a huge cost by any means, but it's also, when you're living on even 2 instructor salaries, it's still hard.
Yeah.
So with that, the other big thing, so I apply to so many shows, and I apply to as many activities as I can, but that is also super draining on your bank account, because for some reason the going rate for applying for shows now is $35.
I know.
That's insane. I used to apply, I used to spend my evenings, I really like true crime shows, and so when I was in grad school,
my girlfriend is also a big fan of true crime.
Yeah. I'd turn on my true crime documentary, and then I'd sit and I'd have a list of shows that I was planning to apply to, or prizes, or whatever it may be. And when I was in grad school, I feel like it was between $10 to $40 usually. There's a couple of them that are obviously a little bit more, but the going rate for them was not near as expensive as it is now. And so with that in mind, if I was going to apply for 3 shows, I was going to be spending $100 at least on those applications. And when you get rejections, it hurts no matter what. But when you get rejections, when you spent that much money on things, you're like, why am I doing this? And it makes you question everything.
Recently.
Yeah.
There's a show in Newport that I applied to. I have all of my MFA prints are over there. I have one that I was damn certain, this is definitely going to get accepted. Mm-hmm. And then I looked at the list of the ones who were accepted, $35 down the drain.
Yes. And so with that in mind, when we decided we would do a theme, and from there, originally we were the ones jurying it, but we realized we wanted new eyes on things because a lot of the same people were applying, and everyone has their own subjective perspective with these things, and we don't want the work to look the same every time. So with all of that in mind, we decided to do a $5 fee for all of our online shows. And we also have fee waivers available. People just have to email us and say, I'm in a tight financial spot. Can I have the fee waiver? And we'd say, sure, it's $5. It's not that big of a deal.
Exactly, yeah.
With that, though, we were, within our first couple of shows, we were able to pay for the online space. And so since then, we've continued that, $5 fee, but with our jurors, we make sure that we're paying them quite a bit to have their expertise and, look through these images. A couple of these shows we've had like 600 images, and so it's a lot for the juror to look through all of that. And I want to make sure that they're being paid, because I know of a lot of places that say, do you want a jury for us? You don't get anything because it's all online. So what does that do to you? You don't have to spend any extra time getting here or anything. And those are the same places that are asking for $50 or so per entry, and so they're just these money making schemes. And we don't want to be that. We want to make sure we're giving back. And so with that, we decided, so Tim is the gallery director here up at Northern, as well as being the 3D instructor. And we decided that each summer, in the summers, there's usually no artists lined up at Northern. And in the Aberdeen area, there's not really any other gallery spaces. So, how can we create a space for people to show their work? And so we came up with that, doing the regular old juried show thing, but this time offering in-person exhibitions that people can send their work to, which you were one of them. And your work is still up there. We'll be taking it down this weekend.
I do need to reply to that email.
Yeah, oh, you're fine. And so with all of that, the additional fees that we had for that show, we put them towards prize money. And so we had, 3 people who were awarded prizes. We have 3 honorable mentions, and then we have 2 other exhibition opportunities that people can get through that show as well. And so really we want to use the privilege that we both have with being able to go to art school and being able to get jobs in academia with access to exhibition spaces. We want to give back in some way and let other people show their work and have it be somewhat cost effective compared to so much of what's going on in the art world now.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing that's been really interesting to observe, at least from online. I haven't gotten to see it too much in person, but I feel like this generation of millennials to the young millennials to that weird middle ground of, I'm not going to use the ideal version of the term, but the zillennials, those of us born in the mid-90s, because people will put us into Gen Z and sometimes they'll put us into millennials because no one can agree. We're in that weird middle ground. But I feel like that generation of actual millennials to us in the middle have that perspective that you and Tim have had on how to approach making Midwest nice. And I see that in some of the other art collective spaces around the country that are often, a lot of times they're put on by people that are like older millennials, if not young Gen Xers. And I think that they share a lot of that same perspective on the art world. It's like a lot of us are so tired of New York and LA and Chicago, as much as I love Chicago, being like those like iron grip, especially New York. And it's like we need to see stuff outside of the big cities.
Yeah.
But there's always like that 1 or 2 like dominant thing within like an hour drive for the small towns, and that's a start. But I definitely think that like things like what you and Tim are doing are helping not only provide for your immediate area, but also allowing people around the country to see that this is possible, even at a small scale that doesn't cost a lot of money to do. And then as you keep doing it, like keep it growing and all that, you start to kind of figure out how to navigate it once you do start to have more people and hopefully more funding to help it out. God forbid you guys get your own actual dedicated space someday, which would be awesome.
That would be amazing.
And I know a lot of galleries also, like they typically will go with, a lot of times they don't like to have people from the outside come in because obviously they have their own inside people. So I really that's been something that I kind of have a little bit of issue with, but I totally understand why they're like that. Yeah.
I think that too, with all of those thoughts, like being in Sioux Falls, we knew all of the art people in that area, and all of the art people, we were all constantly complaining, why isn't there a contemporary, dedicated space? Why doesn't this exist? Why doesn't this exist? And it was always like, well, if we want it to exist, we just have to do it. And so finally we came to that conclusion with this too, where it was like, this is what we need in terms of like our generation. We need to be using the accessibility that the internet has given us and, not gatekeep all of, who gets shows and things. We're not just going to only ask our friends to do things either. We want, more people to be involved and show that, this can happen here. You can do it in your place as well. But if no one else is going to do it, then you have to step up and get started.
Exactly, yeah. Well, I do want to start winding this down finally. I know that you have some stuff coming up that is definitely worth sharing. So I know you mentioned before you have a show in Vermont. So do you have details that you're able to share with the world about that yet?
So the show is going to be, it's going to be another iteration of Wish You Were Here at the Vermont Center for Photography. It'll be up November and December. I'm not 100% sure on the exact dates of that yet, but I will be sharing that on, Instagram and my website soon. Other than that, we do have our next call for art. I'm not sure when you plan to post this, so I don't know if it'll be up or not yet. But our next one that is due is called No Place Like Home, and it is juried by Tom Dahlseed and Leah Schrettenthaler, and they are good friends of ours. I went to school at the University of South Dakota with them, and they now live in Wisconsin, and they're doing fantastic things. And that call is due September 20th, and then we are doing calls every 2 months, so there'll be something new on our website, and we'll have a new person every time as well. I'm sure I'm forgetting something, but it's only the second week of school, but my mind has just, it's gone. So I think that's it right now.
Yeah. Very cool. I think, I know I've been trying to figure out what I want to submit to the next one, and I think I'm looking at them right now.
Nice.
So they're up there.
Yeah.
They need to go somewhere. If they get accepted, they need to go somewhere. But anyway, so of course you got to tell people where they can find you. Yeah, my website, which is epiphanyknedler.com, and my Instagram, which is at epiphanysk, and then our Instagram, that's Midwest Nice Art. And I think that's it. Oh, and on Lens Scratch soon, too. Oh, yes, the Lens Scratch stuff. If y'all do not read Lens Scratch, highly recommend them. I've been reading their stuff since my undergrad. Wonderful human beings, and they got a daily newsletter that has, like, whatever article, interview, something, literally every day, I think, except Sundays. No, they do Sundays as well. They do Sundays, every day. It's every day. There's always something, because they got a lot of people writing for them. So it's a lot of good stuff. Some pretty stonking artists that are hauling ass, and some younger folks like us that are, we're getting our stuff out there. Yes. And it's awesome. They do some great stuff there. Highly recommend signing up for their emails. So thank you so much for taking a good chunk of your day out to talk with me about your stuff. It's been a really awesome conversation. Yes, thank you for asking me again. It's been really wonderful, and it really gets me in the creative mode to start making more things too. So yes, absolutely. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening or watching if you're on YouTube, and I will see you in the next one.